Hello and Assalamu Alaikum. I'm Marwa. Welcome to Naramis. Is privatization really the solution to Pakistan's economic crisis? Or is it just selling the country piece by piece? Today, we break down the reality behind the rhetoric. Every few years, another state-owned enterprise goes on the auction block in Pakistan. Governments call it reform. They say it's about efficiency, transparency, and economic growth. But here's the real question. Has privatization ever truly worked for Pakistan? The current administration, much like the one before it, continues to tout privatization as a panacea for our economic woes. But this idea isn't homegrown. It mirrors the long-standing agenda of the IMF. Privatization is sold as a strategy to plug fiscal gaps, reduce inefficiencies, and encourage competition. The narrative sounds familiar. State-owned enterprises, or SOEs, are slow, bloated, and a drain on the government treasury. So why not just sell them off and let the private sector do what it does best? Generate profit. Let's take a step back. What exactly is privatization? At its core, it means transferring ownership of public assets into private hands. Proponents argue that the private sector, driven by profit, is more efficient, more disciplined, and less vulnerable to political interference. On paper, it's a clean solution. Improve services, reduce government expenditure, and a quick cash influx from the sales. But theory doesn't always match the complex reality of economics. Historically, privatization in Pakistan began in earnest in 1988 under the PPP government and continued through the 1990s and early 2000s under the PMLN and Musharraf regimes. These moves weren't just policy choices. They were often conditions tied to IMF and World Bank loans. Over time, the government sold off key assets in energy, banking, telecommunications, and transport sectors. More than 160 industrial units were privatized by the end of the 1990s. The estimated value of these sales reached Rs 120 billion, with some studies putting the total figure as high as 476 billion rupees by 2010. But what did Pakistan get in return? Multiple reviews of the past privatization processes reveal a disturbing trend. Opacity, poor oversight, and questionable deals that served powerful business interests far more than the public good. Promises of efficiency gains and economic benefits often went unfulfilled. Consider the independent power producers, or IPPs. These companies were granted contracts that virtually guaranteed US dollar-denominated profits, no matter how much electricity they actually generated. The policy also encouraged the use of expensive, inefficient thermal plants running on imported furnace oil. The result? The government ended up paying $21 million more per 100 megawatts than it would have if it had developed the same capacity itself. Then there's PTCL. Sold to UAE-based Etisalat in 2005 for over $2.5 billion, it was supposed to be a flagship success. Instead, the deal turned sour. Over $800 million of the payment still remains outstanding, tangled in disputes over land valuations. PTCL's performance nosedived across every key metric related to profits, tax contributions, and market share, while executive salaries soared. And who could forget K-Electric? Privatized the same year as PTCL, it promised to end Karachi's power woes. But 2 decades later, the city still suffers from outages, inflated bills, and poor customer service. Yet K-Electric continues to post healthy profits. In case after case, we see a familiar pattern. Profits are privatized, while losses are socialized. Privatization isn't just a Pakistani experiment. It's part of a global trend. But the more we look beyond our borders, the more the cracks begin to show. Privatization is seen as a growth tool, rooted in 1970s neoliberalism pushed by the IMF and World Bank in developing nations. For decades, these institutions have promoted privatization as a central pillar of reform. But after nearly half a century of experimentation, particularly in developing nations, the results tell a different story. Let's take a look at post-war Europe. France's industrial boom in the mid-20th century wasn't driven by privatization. It was powered by public enterprises. Companies like Thomson, Renault, and Alcatel led technological modernization backed by the state. In Finland, it was state investment in forestry, steel, transport, and chemicals that laid the foundation for economic success. South Korea also maintained a massive public sector during its most explosive growth years. Its steel, oil, electricity, and fertilizer industries were state-owned and centrally coordinated. The same goes for Taiwan, which has had one of the largest public sectors in the developing world. Even today, its core energy infrastructure remains publicly owned. And what about China, the juggernaut of the 21st century? While many attribute its rise to market liberalization, the truth is more complex. SOEs remain the backbone of the economy. As of the end of 2023, SOEs accounted for half the market capitalization of China's top 100 listed firms. China didn't shrink its public sector to grow. It used it as the engine. From Japan to South Korea, Taiwan to China, the world's most remarkable development stories show a common pattern: strong, strategic public sectors guiding early industrialization. Meanwhile, privatization was closely tied to the breakup of the Soviet Union. The elites who were in power at the time anticipated the collapse of the USSR and began acquiring SOEs for themselves. These individuals later became known as oligarchs in Russia. So even in developed countries, the case for privatization is far from clear-cut. For instance, the United Kingdom, one of the pioneers of large-scale privatization under Margaret Thatcher. Between the 1980s and 1990s, Britain sold off state assets ranging from British Telecom and British Steel to electricity, gas, and rail services. But what followed was not the miracle many had hoped for. Study after study shows mixed or even negative results. The British Airports Authority, no significant performance gains post-privatization. Water and sewerage, productivity only improved after tough regulatory caps. Electricity companies, the benefits were heavily skewed and profits soared for producers. An overall review of UK privatizations by economist Massimo Flori found no clear link to productivity, GDP growth, or national efficiency. In fact, taxpayers lost £14 billion, essentially a wealth transfer to shareholders. In UK Steel, performance actually declined after privatization. Many of the companies that were privatized in the UK were actually profitable. These were not failing institutions. They were generating steady dividends for the government, money that went back into public spending. After privatization, those profits didn't disappear. They just shifted into the hands of private shareholders. The broader takeaway here is that privatization has too often been more about shifting ownership than improving outcomes. Even if we set aside the history, the ideology, and the failures, we're still left with a critical question. What are the built-in disadvantages of privatization? Let's start with natural monopolies. Sectors where competition simply doesn't make sense. Think of tap water. The infrastructure cost is enormous, and it's simply not efficient to have multiple competing companies. In cases like these, privatization doesn't create competition. It just replaces a public monopoly with a private one, where a private monopoly is driven by profit, and that often means higher prices and poorer service for consumers. And it's not just utilities. Sectors like healthcare, education, and public transport don't fit clearly into the market model. These are public services, not just businesses. The introduction of a profit motive can fundamentally distort their purpose. In healthcare, for instance, private firms may prioritize profit margins over patient outcomes. In fact, some of the strongest arguments for public provision are moral and philosophical. Do we really want a system where a doctor's motivation is tied to financial gain rather than patient well-being? Should access to education depend on a student's ability to pay? And even when privatization appears to bring in private actors, the state isn't off the hook. Private monopolies still require regulation. The government still has to monitor prices, enforce safety, and protect consumers. So let us bring the focus back to Pakistan. We're not claiming that our SOEs are well-run paragons of public service. Far from it. Many SOEs are bloated, inefficient, and deeply politicized. Reform is necessary, urgent even, but privatization isn't the only path forward. And as we've seen, it's often the wrong one. There's a better option that doesn't sell off national assets but restructures them. It's called commercialization. Instead of auctioning off public enterprises to the highest bidder, we retain public ownership and make these institutions leaner, more efficient, and more accountable. We introduce business discipline, but we keep public control. And this isn't just theory. Look at Temasek Holdings in Singapore. It's a state-owned investment firm that manages a vast portfolio of government-linked companies, many of which operate globally, generate profits, and remain public. These companies are not stuck in bureaucracy. They're professionally run with clear performance goals. Or take India's ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, a fully state-owned body, yet it competes globally with private space firms. Its achievements, from low-cost Mars missions to launching commercial satellites, prove that public ownership and world-class performance can go hand in hand. There are a number of reasons that suggest commercialization as a better fit for Pakistan. First, it protects strategic assets. Transport, communication, energy, these are not just businesses, they're national lifelines. These sectors are too critical to surrender to private monopolies. Second, it promotes public accountability. A well-managed state enterprise with independent oversight and professional leadership can operate transparently and serve national priorities. Third, it retains profits within the public system. Imagine if PIA or Pakistan Railways turned a profit and that revenue went back into public infrastructure or healthcare instead of into a private pocket. Fourth, it builds internal capacity. Instead of outsourcing expertise or selling off assets, we invest in our own talent, systems, and institutions. This strengthens the state's ability to govern effectively. So what needs to happen next if we're serious about reform? First, pause all further privatizations. Before we repeat past mistakes, we need to evaluate what's already happened. Then audit previous deals. Secondly, reform existing SOEs. Bring in independent boards. Set clear, measurable targets. Appoint professionals, not political allies. Finally, invest in real regulation. Whether an industry is public or private, fair pricing, safety standards, and labor rights must be enforced by strong, competent regulators. Because here's the truth. Privatization in Pakistan hasn't just failed to deliver. It has weakened public services, undermined workers, and handed over critical assets with little return. In this scenario, commercialization isn't about preserving the status quo. It's about redesigning it and making our institutions work for the people they were built to serve. Let's not sell what we can fix. Let's rebuild public assets and make them truly public again. This is it for today's deep dive. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, stay safe and stay kind. Allah Hafiz.